So when I go to see a play, the reviews do carry some weight for me. If the show is described as powerful and poignant or beautifully moving, we kind of get a sense of what to expect, don't we? But today on the podcast, what happens if the reviews are fake? Hey, I'm Ali Hassan, sitting in for Elamin Abdul Mahmoud. This is Commotion, and this first story has got me thinking about my time in Edinburgh. In 2016, I was performing at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. That's how it's named for some reason. And I remember seeing these established performers with these quotes on their show posters. And these were like incredible, enticing, and I came to realize highly coveted quotes. They said things like, gut-wrenchingly funny, says The Guardian, or an absolute cavalcade of laughter, says The Independent. And ever since then, I've kept a keen eye on all of these incredible reviews that I see for a myriad of plays and different shows. But what happens if those reviews are fake and they're not written by an actual critic at all? And recently, the use of AI is showing up in the way that theaters market their plays. That's putting critics in a tough spot professionally, and not to mention people like you and me, because it becomes harder and harder to tell what is real. Aisling Murphy is a freelance theater critic. She wrote about this for the Toronto Star. Aisling, welcome back to Commotion. Can I hear Aisling? Aisling is there? There is
Are you able to hear me?
Aisling, I can hear you. There you are. Yes. How are things?
They're good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Great. Yeah, we might, it might be a little bit difficult for people to imagine how this all works, but you've seen it play out in real life. Can you start off by describing some examples of how you've seen AI used to market certain shows?
Yeah, so this has come up recently in two ways. So the first is I've noticed on posters and other maybe like social media graphics from different theaters, that there are these quotes on there from news sites, quote unquote, that I don't maybe recognize. So there'll be a quote from the Toronto Star, quote from the Globe and Mail, and then a quote from this website called BNN Breaking. And I've worked in breaking news for years. I like to think I'm quite media literate. And when I first saw these review quotes from a site called BNN Breaking, I kind of thought like, I've never heard of that website before. And given that I'm kind of maniacally obsessed with theater criticism, it's a little weird that I haven't heard of the theater criticism site that these theaters are using. So that's one way. And I imagine that we'll kind of come back to that.
You are breaking news. And to hear something says breaking and you don't know about it, yeah, I'm sure that that struck a chord, and not in a good way.
Definitely not in a good way, no.
I want you focused on Toronto companies, the theater companies, but have you heard of this happening elsewhere as well?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting that this is happening now because we're seeing a bit of a debate on Broadway right now, particularly with the new musical Limpitska. And this isn't where we're looking at AI generated reviews necessarily, but we're seeing that theaters are maybe quoting these reviews not in good faith. So we'll see. There's a poster that Limpitska recently put out that got a lot of people talking. And it said on one side of the poster, it's a stirring blockbuster, quoting Ben Brantley of the New York Times. But then on the other side of the poster, they're quoting Jesse Green from the New York Times, saying that it's an overeager blur. And so they're kind of putting like this very negative review into conversation with this very positive review. Neither of those reviews were ever really positive, is the thing. Like both reviews were quite middling, quite, there was room to grow with this show. And I think both reviews really talk about that. So the fact that this Broadway theater has really kind of spun these review quotes in a way that maybe better suits the narrative of the show, that maybe makes it sound a little better than people are saying it is, it's definitely sparked a big debate in the international theater criticism community, I'd say. So
let me clarify this for myself. Are these words that were ever said by these journalists, by these critics about things, or is it just an amalgamation of their words? Or is it simply somebody saying, hey, ChatGPT, give me a New York Times review for this show, and the aggregator just collects whatever it wants?
Yeah, so in the case of Limpitska, those words definitely appear in the review. just maybe not in the way that the marketers want us to think so. So I think that they're being a little cavalier with like an ellipsis to maybe take some words out of context, potentially.
Okay, that ellipsis lets you be pretty loosey-goosey apparently in this world. So, yeah, BNN breaking that you mentioned, those seeing those bylines attributed to staffers at BNN breaking is what took you down the rabbit hole, from what I understand, right? How does BNN breaking operate? Were you able to find out?
Yeah, I went down a rabbit hole about this. So, as far as I understand it, BNN Breaking is a content aggregator that's essentially scraping news sources and news stories on the internet to find things to write about using AI. And for me, I was quite interested that it was these two Toronto theater shows, one at Soul Pepper Theater and one at Theater Passe Muraille, that in the grand scheme of things, they're not like huge world premieres or anything. Like they're great Toronto theater shows, but they're Toronto theater shows. So it was a little weird to me that this international website would write about them in any capacity, let alone a review. And I sort of went and I read these quote unquote reviews, and I'm thinking to myself, wait a minute, I wrote a feature for the Toronto Star about As I Must Live It at Theatre Passe Muraille, and I'm seeing some words and phrases in this review by someone else that sound kind of familiar to me. Like I feel like I'm reading my own writing back to myself, but my own writing that's been put through maybe ChatGPT or some other AI writing device. And I went down this rabbit hole. I'm like, okay, what is BNN breaking? How is this happening? Why am I seeing this in Toronto theater marketing? I don't understand why this would be the review that we'd use in pull quotes for posters when there's so many other bloggers and critics in town. I was really curious and then really kind of frightened by the fact that these AI reviews have snuck into the conversation in a way that I don't necessarily think we invited them to participate, I suppose.
So Aisling, the plot thickens there a little bit because your words were used but not attributed to you either. So it's words out of context and also words that some people said about something completely different. So tell me, I mean, the obvious question now is, why are theater companies doing this? What are they saying in response to these accusations, I suppose, or feels factual more than accusatory?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like I just kind of want to say, like, I have a lot of empathy for these theater companies who are trying to market their shows. There's not a lot of theater critics in Canada. There are two full-time salaried English language theater critics in Canada. There's Kelly Nestruck at the Globe and Mail and then Joshua Chong at the Toronto Star. And those two people are really busy. Like, you're not going to get to review everything. And so theaters are then put in a tight spot of, okay, there's only so many freelance critics and bloggers. It's really not a lot of people who are writing about theater full time and covering everything in the city, never mind the country. So if theaters are looking for pull quotes to market their shows in the same way that, bigger companies like Mirvish might be able to, they're put in kind of a tough spot. It's like, okay, how are we going to find quotes to sell our show? Are we going to use maybe bloggers who are newer to writing about theater? Or if we see this website online where the writing sounds kind of pretty and they're speaking really nicely about our show, why wouldn't we take that? So I think that's kind of what happened with BNN Breaking is, potentially some marketing departments saw this really positive writing about their shows without necessarily thinking, what is this outlet? Did we invite this outlet? Stuff like that.
Yeah. What I want to know is, you did approach these theater companies about this. What was the response that they gave you in return?
Yeah, I mean, so the publicist for Theatre Passe Muraille, Suzanne Sheridan, she was kind of as horrified about this as I was. And she, speaking on behalf of Theatre Passe Muraille, but also for herself, she kind of said, like, look, I've been a publicist in the arts for decades, and this is a brand new problem. This is something that the industry is going to have to reckon with on a much larger scale. Like 100% this, we will be more diligent moving forward. Our marketing department will be more diligent moving forward. But this is an unprecedented level of almost infiltration from AI in a way that, anyone who went to like marketing school or even PR school 10 or more years ago, this never would have come up even as a possibility. So like Theatre Passe Muraille was very quick to say, you know what, we won't do this again. We're going to be a lot more diligent. So was Soul Pepper. I think that theaters really do want to do better. It's just also managing the doing better, and they really need quotes, and there's not enough people to write about these shows. It's really such a complex problem.
Yeah, I was mentioning at the beginning that it's a problem, for us as viewers as well. How do you tell the difference between a legitimate review and then one written by AI? And this is a conversation not just about AI, but also the value of criticism. Once you remove criticism, you're just left with marketing. What do you look for as a viewer in a review to suggest if it's genuine or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's once you've been reading enough writing by ChatGPT and other AI
Hmm.
generators, you kind of start to see clues that maybe what you're reading isn't quite human. For my Toronto Star article, I spoke with an expert from the University of Toronto, David Rokeby, and he put it amazingly. He's like, look, if you look at the review of As I Must Live It, it has that in conclusion part. And what he's talking about is towards the end of the review, the writer, quote unquote, literally says, in conclusion, dot, 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 this show is excellent and everyone should see it. And it kind of sounds a bit like a third grade book report. And ChatGPT is really good at writing third grade book reports, but it's not so good at writing real reviews. And what David said, he's like, look, that's such mansplaining nonsense. It sounds like someone's condescending to you, even though it's a theater review. And I find that tone and that sort of like extremely over-explaining writing can be a really good sign that maybe what you're reading isn't a real human review. It's from AI.
All right. Thank you for those tips, making us feel a little bit more secure in this insecure environment. Thanks very much, Aisling. Appreciate you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Aisling Murphy is a freelance theater critic and culture writer. You can find her work in the Toronto Star, Intermission Magazine, and Next Magazine. Hey, I'm Ali Hassan, sitting in for Elamin Abdul Mahmoud. This is Commotion. And a lot of the way we see history is shaped by how we see it portrayed on screen. And the lens which we often see the Vietnam War in pop culture through is from the American point of view. Author Viet Thanh Nguyen describes that dominance so clearly in an interview with Terry Gross on Fresh Air from a number of years ago. He talks about watching Apocalypse Now when he was around 10 years old after coming to the U.S. with his family to escape the war in Vietnam.
Because I watched that movie as a good American boy who had already seen some American war movies, John Wayne in World War II, and I was cheering for the American soldiers until the moment in Apocalypse Now where they started killing Vietnamese people. And that was an impossible moment for me because I didn't know who I was supposed to identify with, the Americans who were doing the killing or the Vietnamese who were dying and not being able to speak. And that moment has never left me as the symbolic moment of my understanding that this was our place in an American war, that the Vietnam War was an American war from the American perspective, and that eventually I would have to do something about that.
And he did. Viet Thanh Nguyen wrote the novel The Sympathizer in 2015. It's the story of a half-French, half-Vietnamese spy living in Los Angeles in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And it was critically acclaimed, won the Pulitzer Prize. And The Sympathizer is now a series airing on HBO on Sundays. Episode 2 dropped yesterday. I know this because I was up late watching it last night. The showrunners are Park Chan-wook, Korean director of classics like Old Boy, was part of the Vengeance trilogy, and Canadian filmmaker Don McKellar. And to talk about this adaptation of The Sympathizer, Hoai-Tran Bui is here. Hi, Hoai-Tran. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you have read this book, and when you heard The Sympathizer was turning into a TV series with Park Chan-wook involved, what were your expectations of it?
My expectations were entire excitement. I love this book. I think it's a masterpiece and destined to be a modern classic. And I felt like Park Chan-wook was a perfect fit to adapt this book because not only does his particular acerbic sort of dark, wild swing tonal style particularly suit this kind of strange, surreal story. Viet Thanh Nguyen has also spoken about how Park Chan-wook was a big inspiration for him in writing The Sympathizer. I'm sure after seeing episode 2, you kind of can draw the comparisons. There's a scene with the squid that is a little sexual in nature and might draw to mind a very famous scene in Old Boy. But outside of that, it's kind of in the DNA of The Sympathizer, this sort of very sharp, very pitch black tone that I think that Park Chan-wook has translated really well in the miniseries.
I outlined the plot of The Sympathizer loosely and briefly. And part of it is also because I was a little confused. It was more compelling than it was confusing. And I was desperate to watch the second episode. But maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what The Sympathizer is about.
Yes, so The Sympathizer follows an unnamed protagonist, only known as the Captain to us, who is a mole in the with the South Vietnamese refugees who escaped from Vietnam post-Vietnam War. He is actually a sympathizer with the Communist Party that wins the Vietnam War, so to speak, and is instructed by his handler, Mun, who is also his childhood best friend, to keep an eye on and keep spying on the general who was one of the leading generals of the South Vietnamese army. And he, in his time in California, where he is sort of embedded, where he had been before as a student in college, he kind of finds himself torn between his two worlds. He's biracial, half Vietnamese, half French, and he's torn between his two worlds, his two loyalties, his two identities this entire time, and kind of has to figure out, where he stands. But it's not quite so straightforward as that. It's very much a story about the shadows of war and the Vietnam War in particular, and how it can continue to be fought and to haunt people long after the war has been declared over.
Sure. How would you describe the tone of the book?
Like I said before, razor sharp, very, very pitch black, very acerbic, acidic. It's narrated by an unreliable narrator, as we learned. We never learned his name. He only goes by the Captain. And a lot of the stories that he tells, the framing device of this story is he's in a re-education camp back in Vietnam after having returned, and he's telling his story to kind of try to convince his guards that he is in fact a loyal communist. But he doesn't quite remember it all, and he kind of adds a lot of flourishes. And through that framing device, through that structure, we hear his story, and we are really never sure what exactly is true or false. So it's definitely a very kind of surreal modern novel, I would say.
Yeah. And I haven't read the book yet. I'm going to put a yet in there. I'm very intrigued to do so. Would you say that the series captures the tone of the book well?
I would say so, yes. I think that Park Chan-wook has such a specific visual style and directorial flair that he brings to life some of those surreal touches of the book in ways that I think really suit the visual medium. He really plays with style and just directorial choices that feel that kind of puts you off kilter, that kind of make you feel like you're not really sure what this reality is. And it plays a lot with the dissonance too of violence and kind of joy and love and that kind of thing. And I think that is a good way of honing into what the novel did really well.
And I should mention too, Hoai-Tran, that I said he's show running the show, but he's doing more. He's directing the first 3 episodes, writing on every episode. So his fingerprints are all over the show. You interviewed Park Chan-wook and talked to him about why he wanted to make The Sympathizer. What did he say?
Yeah, so this interview is not yet published, but I spoke with him briefly before the premiere of the show. And I asked him specifically why he, as a Korean director, thought that he would be a right choice to direct this singularly Vietnamese story. And what he told me was really interesting. He said that he found himself drawn to this story because he always found the cultural and historical similarities between Koreans and Vietnamese to be very similar and very interesting. Historically, we've had wars that have divided the country, that have had American participation and interference in some way. And that has always been sort of like a part of our recent historical memory. And culturally, it's also like somewhat similar. Korea is part of like the East Asian contingent, and Vietnam is very much part of the Southeast Asian contingent. For a long time, they were industrializing rapidly, and Korea only kind of became recently much more prolific because of the influx of K-pop and the Korean media industry. But for a long time, it was kind of very similar paths historically and culturally. And I found that comparison from him to be very interesting, just because I personally found some of those similarities too. I have a cousin who runs a Vietnamese restaurant, and he has a Korean chef who is the chief chef for it. And I was talking to her, and she told me about how some Korean dishes some Vietnamese dishes she tried that even I hadn't tried before, that were very rural and very like geographically specific, remind her a lot of like very traditional Korean dishes. So I found that to be quite fascinating.
We anxiously await the prevalence of V-pop, Hoai-Tran, and then one day, Vietnam will rise again and compete against Korea. I wanted to mention this. Robert Downey Jr. plays multiple characters throughout the series. I would have liked to have known that out of the gate, to be honest. There was a few confusing minutes for me there. So I'll share this as a service to our viewers and our listeners. He's a CIA officer in the first episode. We later see him as a grad school prof, and then, as I understand it, a politician, also a Hollywood director. What do you think of that decision to cast Robert Downey Jr. in multiple roles?
I know that this decision is actually quite controversial amongst a lot of Asian American critics, who have come to The Sympathizer with a bit more of a lukewarm approach than I have. I think that Robert Downey Jr. obviously had a huge part in kind of making this show more prolific. Park Chan-wook obviously is very well loved within the film community, but Robert Downey Jr. definitely had a big hand in making this show as big as it is. He and Team Downey also produced The Sympathizer, so they definitely like gave it a boost and probably helped give it that HBO sort of Sunday night matinee, time slot. But I think that, and I know that the actual performances that Robert Downey Jr. gives have been a little bit grating amongst a lot of Asian American critics as well, because they find it to be a little too showy, a little too distracting away from the central Vietnamese story. But I don't totally agree with that. I think that it actually is the best visualization that we can see of that unreliable narrator that we have in the book. And I think it also really comes to a satisfying conclusion later on in the season. I've seen the full show, so I can't give spoilers, but a major reason for why Robert Downey Jr. is playing all of these patriarchal white male figures in the captain's life is because he represents in some way this sort of, imperialist figure that is always sort of oppressing and pressuring and kind of tearing our narrator into like different directions in many ways. And I think that it also kind of Robert Downey Jr.'s casting as all these characters kind of taps into this anti-imperialist undertone that I feel like is even more present in the show than even in the book.
Yeah.
It's kind of present in the book, but it becomes even more present in the book sequel, which is also really incredible.
Hoai-Tran, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. I wanted to also congratulate you. Your parents and your relatives are now retweeting your tweet, and they're right. You've talked to one of the big people in the world, and you're getting pride from your own family. So congratulations as a child of an immigrant. I know how that feels.
Thank you.
Hoai-Tran Bui is an entertainment editor at Inverse. The Sympathizer airs on HBO on Sundays. And you can check out the Q podcast. Tom Power recently talked with Montreal actor and stunt performer Fred Nguyen Khan. It's spelled Khan. I thought he was part Pakistani for a moment. He is not, but he does star in The Sympathizer, does a fantastic job alongside Sandra Oh and Robert Downey Jr. That is it for the podcast today. Remember, you can listen to Commotion anytime, wherever you get your podcast. Check us out on YouTube and Instagram. We're at Commotion CBC. I'm Ali Hassan, sitting in for Elamin Abdul Mahmoud. I'll see you again real soon.